For 13 years, five guys from Bakersfield, California were more than just a band. They were a brotherhood, a monolithic force of nature that redefined heavy music for a generation. At the heart of Korn's chaotic, groovy, and utterly unique sound was drummer Davis Silveria. His displaced, funk-infused, and relentlessly hard-hitting style was the backbone of Korn's 90s and 2000s era sound. But in 2006, that backbone was literally and figuratively broken, starting a chain of events that would end his time in the band that he helped build. What if I told you the story of his departure wasn't a simple lineup change, but a far more tragic tale? What if a routine workout spiraled into a debilitating injury, a crippling pill dependency, a total communication breakdown, and a bitter legal war that shattered a brotherhood? This isn't just about a drummer leaving a band. It's the full complicated story of how a friendship forged in the fires of global success could dissolve into a cold, hard business dispute, leaving a legacy of bitterness and a question that still haunts fans to this very day. What really happened? Before we get started with today's video, if you want to support my channel, be sure to hit the like and subscribe button. I've heard from some of you that you're finding yourselves unsubscribed from my channel or not seeing my new videos pop up, so make sure you turn on all notifications so you don't miss out. Before the lawsuits and the public feuds, there was just the music. When Korn exploded onto the scene in 1994, the world had never heard anything quite like them. Their self-titled debut was a raw, visceral howl from the depths of suburban angst, unleashing a sound that would define the nu metal genre. You had Jonathan Davis's tortured, scatting vocals, the down-tuned 7-string sludge of Monkey and Head's guitars, and Fieldy's percussive clicking bass, all creating a sound that was both terrifying and intoxicating. But holding it all together, providing that signature swing and deep pocket groove that made you want to both headbang and dance, was Davis Silveria. He was the rhythmic engine of Korn from the very beginning. He wasn't just a timekeeper, he was an architect of the band's sound, a vital creative voice who blended funk-infused rhythms with raw, untamed power of metal. On foundational tracks like Blind and the massive Grammy-winning hit Freak on a Leash, his drumming was a personality in its own right. He famously said his aggressive style, his need to hit too hard, was both his signature and prophetically a physical liability. For over a decade, this lineup seemed an inseparable, unbreakable unit. They sold over 40 million albums, they defined the sound of a generation, and fans saw them as five sides of the same coin. But behind the scenes, cracks were starting to form long before anyone on the outside knew. The foundation of friendship that the entire empire was built on was slowly eroding, and it would only take one catastrophic event to bring the whole thing crashing down. The beginning of the end wasn't some dramatic rock and roll cliche of a fight in a studio or on stage. It was a mundane moment at home that turned into a life-altering catastrophe. In his own words, the incident was almost absurdly simple. The last year I was with Korn, he later recalled, I was working out in my house and I was doing squats with my dumbbells in my hand, and I bent down and I looked up at what was on the TV and I arced my back backwards and I broke my back. At first, he didn't grasp the severity, and like any dedicated musician, he just simply tried to push through the pain. He recalled, I sustained a back injury that I decided to treat with massages and pills so that I could continue to work in the band. But the pain didn't just linger. It got progressively worse to the point that he could barely walk more than 50 feet at a time. A doctor gave him a cloudy x-ray and a dangerous temporary solution. He just started giving me a bunch of pain pills, Silveria admitted, acknowledging this was the start of a serious dependency on opioids. The pills were just a mask. It was only when he finally got a second opinion that the horrifying truth came out. A new specialist looked at his scans and delivered the shocking news. His back had been broken for over a year. The damage was catastrophic. He had broken 4 pars bones, the small bones that connect the vertebrae. The disc between his lowest 2 vertebrae were completely gone. The required surgery was extreme, involving screws, pins, and a synthetic disc to essentially clamp together his lowest vertebrae together. The required surgery was extreme, involving screws, pins, and a synthetic disc to essentially clamp his lowest vertebrae together. The surgery was a medical necessity, but it left him with permanent arthritis in his lower back. This physical trauma was the undeniable catalyst, the clear reason he had to step away from the grueling demands of touring. But as he would later reveal, the physical pain was only half the story. The emotional fractures that had been developing for years were about to be exposed, turning a necessary medical hiatus into a permanent bitter exile. While his broken back was the immediate cause for his hiatus, Davis Silveria is adamant that the real reason he never returned was a complete and total breakdown of communication. The brotherhood that had defined the early years, the five guys against the world, had decayed into a cold, impersonal business arrangement. He recalled, there was never any reason I could think of, but it just seemed like at that point we kind of stopped communicating with each other, like we had in the past. He pinpointed the decline to around 2004, a full 2 years before he stepped away. The problem? The raw open dialogue that had fueled their creativity was gone. Instead of the 5 of them talking things out in a room together, a new, colder process took over. He remembered, instead of talking as a band, individuals would start calling our managers and talking to them about things. And it kind of broke our communication between all of us as a band. Issues that were once handled face-to-face were now being filtered through third parties with their own agendas, and the dynamic was replaced by a sterile corporate one. He added, I think once that started to happen, the relationships between everyone kind of steadily went on a decline. This was devastating for Silveria, who cherished the memory of the band's origins, adding, when we started the band, we were all just really good friends. It was a really great friendship. It was a really great relationship. For him, the loss of that camaraderie was the real tragedy at the heart of the split. While he was at home dealing with excruciating pain, complex surgery, and a dependency on painkillers, he felt an increasing sense of isolation as well. The support system he should have had from his bandmates simply wasn't there anymore. The band had become a machine, and when one of its core parts broke down, the machine just kept moving, leaving him behind. The toxic combination of physical agony and emotional detachment created a perfect storm. In late 2006, the band officially announced that David was going on a temporary hiatus. To the public and the press, it seemed like a standard pause for a musician to recover, but for Silveria, the passion he once felt was already extinguished. He recalled, I think that's what kind of drove me not to having the kind of fire in me to go back. The band that he had loved had transformed into something he no longer recognized or wanted to be a part of, just because the communication had broken down to the point where it wasn't even a band anymore. It was just kind of like a business, he explained. He confessed that it got to the point where he was faking being passionate. For an artist whose entire style was built on raw kinetic energy, faking it just wasn't an option. The hiatus was his breaking point. But as he recovered from his major surgery, the silence from his bandmates was deafening. The temporary break began to feel unnervingly permanent. The band, meanwhile, had to move on. They brought in world-class drummers like Terry Bozzio and Joey Jordison for session work before hiring Rick Luzier as a full-time member in 2009. For Silveria, watching the band he co-founded, not just to continue but to thrive without him, was the ultimate unspoken confirmation. The chapter was closed, the hiatus had morphed into an unceremonious silent firing. Of course, every story has two sides, and this one is no different. While David's narrative is a painful one of injury and isolation, the remaining members of Korn painted a different picture, one of professional concerns and what they perceived as his waning dedication long before the injury. In a 2007 interview, frontman Jonathan Davis didn't mince words about the situation. He stated, it was a mutual decision between the band, but on a basic level, David's playing and his technique were just gone. He recalled the frustration of trying to get the band together to work on what would become their untitled album, only for Silveria to be repeatedly unavailable. He'd add, we'd set up rehearsals and David was like, no, I can't make it. And then we'd arrange another one and he'd be like, no, I can't make it. So I said to him, I think you need to take a break, and I haven't heard from him since. From the band's perspective, they were trying to maintain their creative momentum, and their drummer was unable or unwilling to participate. Davis also theorized that Silveria had simply lost his passion for playing drums and that the injury was more of a final straw than a root cause, adding, the first 2 albums I think he really enjoyed playing drums, and then after that he just lost his love for playing drums. It happens. This narrative portrays Silveria not as a victim of circumstance, but as someone who had artistically checked out, creating a classic he said, they said scenario that left fans to wonder which version was closer to the truth. In 2013, Davis was asked about a possible reunion with Silveria, to which he responded, no, I don't want to say any negative stuff, but where we are at right now is perfect. Ray is an amazing drummer. He fits in good and doesn't have any typical drummer's complexes. For years, the split remained a sore spot for fans and a topic of private bitterness, but in 2015, that bitterness erupted into a full-blown public legal war. David sued his former bandmates, arguing his departure was only ever a temporary hiatus and that he still held ownership interest in Korn's partnership. He claimed that when he was ready and able to return in 2013, the band refused to let him back in. The lawsuit demanded his share of the band's profits since his 2006 departure. What seemed to sting Silveria the most, however, was the perceived hypocrisy of the situation. Guitarist Brian Head Welch, who had left the band in 2005 for personal and religious reasons, had been welcomed back into the fold in 2013, while Silveria's own request to rejoin was denied. He had even sent an impassioned plea via video to his old bandmates asking to reunite the original lineup. The response delivered not by them but through their manager was a firm and unequivocal no. It was in 2015 Silveria slammed the music Korn had been making since he left. Korn promptly countersued, and in 2016 the two parties reached a settlement. Silveria agreed to give up his rights to all future Korn royalties in exchange for a lump sum payment. It seemed like the ugly transactional chapter was finally over, but the peace would be short-lived. The 2016 settlement was supposed to be the final word, the legal document that buried the past, but they were wrong. Just 2 years later, in 2018, the conflict reignited with a vengeance. Korn accused Silveria of violating their hard-won agreement. According to the band, Silveria contacted SoundExchange, the organization that collects and distributes digital performance royalties, and claimed he was still entitled to a share of the money. This was a direct violation of the settlement where he had given up those rights. When the band's representatives demanded he withdraw the claim, he refused, and as a result, SoundExchange did the only thing it could in the dispute. It put a hold on all of Korn's royalty payouts, freezing approximately $300,000 in payments. Frustrated and financially impacted, Korn's original members sued Silveria again in early 2019 for breach of contract. Silveria, not backing down, promptly countersued, and the legal machine whirred back to life, dragging all the dirty laundry from their shared history back into the public eye. Finally, in November of 2019, another settlement was reached, ending the second bitter legal war in just 4 years. Despite the years of ugly legal battles, the story isn't entirely without a glimmer of humanity. Time, it seems, has a way of sanding down the sharpest edges of resentment. In 2019, Silveria expressed some regret for his part in the public feud, admitting he was immature, hurt, and mad that the band wouldn't let him back in. He claimed to have apologized to his former bandmates for some of the things he'd later said. In 2021, Brian Head Welch, in an interview, acknowledged the shared history and personal loss, simply stating that despite everything, he missed Silveria. Then in October of 2024, on the 30th anniversary of the group's groundbreaking debut album, both Jonathan Davis and David Silveria made separate, respectful posts on social media. Davis even mentioned Silveria by name, calling him a brother, a small but significant gesture. It suggests that with enough time, some of the deepest wounds can begin to scar over, even if they never fully disappear. Today, David Silveria has largely stepped away from the music scene, having left his last band in 2022 to focus on his family. Korn continues on with Ray Luzier, a phenomenal drummer in his own right, but for old school fans, there will always be a sense that something essential is missing. That original, funky, unreplicable groove that David Silveria brought to the chaos. The departure of David Silveria from Korn wasn't a simple firing or a straightforward resignation. It was a slow, painful implosion caused by a perfect storm of physical trauma, a communication breakdown, and the sad transformation of a band of brothers into a business entity. A freak accident broke his back, but it was the lack of communication and lost camaraderie that ultimately broke his spirit and his bond with his band that he helped create. The years of legal battles that followed were just the ugly public fallout of a friendship that had already died behind closed doors. While recent reflection suggests some measure of peace has finally been found, the saga stands as a permanent scar on the legacy of one of modern metal's most important bands. A sad final chapter to a partnership that once changed the world. That brings us to the end of today's video, guys. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again in Rock and Roll True Stories. Take care.